Look at me, I'm in a hospital bed with tubes, in pain. I can barely lift my head. I asked my daughter to turn on the camera because I still needed to talk. I won't take long because my body can't take it anymore, but what happened to me changed everything. My name is Valentina, I'm Argentinian. I was born in Buenos Aires, and for many years I worked as a specialist in clinical neurology. I suffered a very serious cardiovascular collapse while treating patients at the hospital where I worked. My heart stopped, and in that time between life and death, I saw things I can no longer keep to myself. Jesus showed me what is happening now in 2026 and sent me back with a single purpose, to warn you about the marked places. Because if you are in those places, when the first great upheaval comes, it will be very difficult to get out. Before the collapse, I was a woman who didn't believe in anything I couldn't measure or prove. A doctor trained at the University of Buenos Aires, with a specialization in Barcelona and years of practice in the best hospitals in Spain and Argentina. My world was the human brain, the synapse, clinical data, MRI results. For me, faith was misdiagnosed psychology. When my own patients told me that during surgery they had seen a tunnel of light or heard a voice calling them, I would take notes with perfectly trained clinical kindness and then write in the chart hypoxic episode with dissociative type hallucinations. I was a woman of logic, of protocol, of producible evidence. I lived well, I earned well. I believed that I understood how the world worked because I had spent 20 years studying the organ that supposedly makes us human. I was proud of my career, my publications, my name at international conferences. I never imagined that on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing lab results in the doctor's lounge, my own heart would drop me to the floor without any warning. The collapse was silent. That's how they told me later, because I don't remember the moment I fell. There was no chest pain, no warning signs like the ones I myself had taught generations of residents to recognize. The world simply went dark. My colleagues found me on the floor. They worked on me for several minutes, or perhaps minutes, while the machines I had trusted my entire professional life registered no sign of life from me. And it was in those minutes, in that total silence of the monitors, that everything I'm about to tell you began. From this bed, with my daughter holding the camera and me barely able to speak loudly. When I left my body, I didn't feel fear, and that was the first thing that surprised me as a doctor, because I had expected dying to be terrifying. I had been present many times at the moment of others' deaths. I had seen that instant from the perspective of the living who observe, but from within. The moment I departed, what I felt was a calm so profound and so physical in its intensity that I can find no comparison that does it justice in any language I know. I felt a strange calm that I had never felt before. I woke up. I saw my own body down there. I saw my colleagues working on me. I saw the oxygen mask. I saw the hands pressing on my chest. I saw the white hospital floor I had trod thousands of times, but which from above had a sheen I had never noticed. I saw all of that with perfect clarity, and yet it no longer held me. It was like observing a scene that concerned me, but that no longer belonged to me in the same way. And then the space around me began to transform. The sky, if you can call it that, took on a color that doesn't exist in any electromagnetic spectrum I've studied. A deep, electric purple that pulsed as if it were breathing, not like a strobe light, not like any phenomenon I could categorize from a neurological perspective. It was a color that was alive, and then a vibration that wasn't sound, but that was more real than any sound I've ever heard. It called me by my name, by my full name. Valentina Cecilia Moreno Aramburu, with the accent of my maternal grandmother when she was little, with a tenderness I recognized before understanding where it came from. I turned around and I was no longer in the hospital. I was in a space made of a clarity that didn't illuminate physical objects, but decisions. Every wrong decision I had made in life appeared before me in a way that no functional MRI could record, not like a movie, but as an instantaneous and total understanding that hurt in a way that no physical pain can reach. I saw every time I was arrogant with a patient who spoke to me about God. or I saw every time someone extended a hand to me in something I called superstition and I responded with a condescending smile. I saw every time I listened to my conscience and ignored it because it was more convenient to move on. I saw my youngest daughter calling me crying one night and me telling her I was on call and that we would talk later. I saw it all at once, and the weight of that vision was a pain that 20 years of medicine hadn't prepared me to process. And then he appeared. I can't describe in words what I saw, because any description I attempt will fall short, will be a blurry shadow of the reality of that moment. He wasn't the Jesus of the religious paintings that decorated my grandmother's office in Mendoza. He was, if not a figure floating on clouds, wearing a robe and with flowing hair, like in the paintings I had observed all my life, with the detachment of someone who looks at art without seeking spiritual meaning. He was a presence of such absolute authority and at the same time a love so overwhelming that those two things in him are inseparable. They are a single, indivisible reality. I fell to my knees, even though in that space I didn't have physical knees. It wasn't a decision, it was the natural response of the soul when it recognizes its origin. He approached, didn't say anything with his mouth, but suddenly I understood everything, not because it had been explained to me, but because I was given to understand that it is something completely different. And what I understood in that first instant is that he loved me, not the love of the education or duty, a love that I, who have studied the biochemistry of romantic and maternal love, and who have read all the papers on the limbic system and oxytocin, had never experienced in the remotest approach. She showed me the globe, but not the blue and green planet of satellite photographs. It was a planet covered by a network of red dots and thick shadows that pulsed with a regularity that I, as a doctor, immediately recognized as the rhythm of something that is growing, not just growing, growing. And she said to me with a calmness that still makes me tremble from this bed when I remember it, "Daughter, look what is already happening in 2026. Many people are building their lives on sand without realizing that the ground is going to give way." The images began to flash before me. I saw Europe, I saw Brazil, or I saw Mexico and Colombia, I saw France and the United States. I saw cities that people today consider the dream of life, becoming stages for a confusion that has no name in social psychology manuals. I saw places full of famous and successful people being covered by a shadow that didn't turn off the electric lights of the buildings, but rather extinguished the light within people. And he explained to me that the greatest danger of 2026 doesn't come from what we can see with our eyes. It doesn't come from a new pathogen, nor from a declared war, nor from a climate disaster that our predictive models can anticipate. It comes from what was prepared in the shadows for decades and that now in 2026 is maturing while the world looks the other way. He told me that I was going to return to my body with a very clear mission, to recount what I saw and to name the places. Because whoever listens and understands will have time to get away before the first major sign appears. The blood moon of March 3, 2026, was already the sign of the beginning, and that is exactly what I am doing now from this hospital bed with my daughter holding the camera, my hands trembling, with a pain in my chest that coexists with an urgency that is greater than the pain. Because what Jesus showed me about what has already begun to unfold in 2026 is too specific to keep quiet. He showed me dates, he showed me places, he showed me what will happen in the cities that the entire world considers the pinnacle of civilization. He showed me the scenario that begins to reveal itself right after the blood moon and what that sign will unleash in the following months: Europe, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, France, the United States, all marked, all with a role in what is to come. And one by one, he explained to me why I need to tell you. Then he began to show me the places, not as a scientific presentation, not as a risk assessment, but like a mother taking her daughter by the shoulders and pointing out the danger before she takes the wrong step. And that image resonated deeply with me because I am a mother, and I know exactly what that looks like. I know exactly the mixture of love and urgency in that gesture. The first thing I saw was a vision of the great coastal cities, the cities that never sleep, full of neon lights and people running without knowing exactly where they were going. I saw New York, I saw parts of the Brazilian coast, the Northeast and Sao Paulo. Lisbon, I saw Barcelona, but there was something different about them in 2026, something that I, as a specialist in clinical neurology, would want to describe in terms of the autonomic nervous system, but that doesn't really fit into any of those categories. The air in those cities was dense, charged with a static electricity that made people's skin prickle for no apparent reason, without a drop in temperature, without a measurable electric field, without any explanation within the physics I studied. And he explained to me that the first sign of places to avoid is spiritual noise, where the human ego has reached its limit and the connection with God has been severed so systematically, so prolongedly, and so deliberately that it is no longer an accidental severing, but a voluntary amputation, or it becomes a whirlpool of emotional chaos that affects everyone who enters it. And those places already exist, not in the future. Right now, as I speak to you, He showed that starting in March 2026, right after the blood moon, the places that depend entirely on technology and the digital financial system to survive will begin to fail in ways that engineers won't be able to explain within their models. These won't be ordinary technical failures. They will be signs that the protection over these structures is being gradually, but irreversibly, withdrawn. And he said it with a seriousness that pierced me to my core. It's not the water they should fear first. It's the void that will be left when what they believe is secure disappears in the blink of an eye. And that's when he pointed to a specific city on the west coast of the United States, a place that has always been a symbol of dreams and fame, and of everything the modern world considers the destiny of those who succeed. I saw a shadow walking along the avenues of that city. It wasn't a physical shadow. It was an absence of peace so radical that people simply began to move without coordination, without coherent direction, as if the instinct for survival had been activated, but without anyone being able to identify the source of the threat. And that, as a neurologist, is one of the most dangerous states that human beings can experience collectively. Then she took me to see Europe, and what I saw in Europe weighed more heavily on me than anything other about that entire experience. Oh, I'm Latin American. I grew up with a faith mixed with the culture inherited from my grandmothers. Never fully understood, but neither entirely discarded. But what I saw in Europe was the result of generations of systematic neglect, of something that when it's lost on that scale, you don't know how to recover. I saw regions that were the cradle of the Christian faith, now shrouded in a cold that wasn't climatic, but a cold of indifference, a cold of forgetting God that had settled not only in people, but in the very structures of those societies, in institutions, governments, educational systems, and even the architecture of daily life. I saw ancient churches in France, Italy, and Germany, transformed into architecture museums, entertainment centers, corporate event spaces, or contemporary art galleries where the only permitted spirituality is aesthetics. Millennia-old stones that once pulsed with life, now emptied of everything that made them sacred in the first place. And he told me, with a sadness that I still feel in my chest when I remember that moment, a sadness that wasn't helplessness, but the pain of love, those places that were once my home are now empty shells. Don't seek refuge in the stone that has forgotten my name. And I, a doctor and not a theologian, who spent 2 decades in hospitals and laboratories and not cathedrals, felt those words, as we in medicine feel the diagnosis of something that no longer has a technical solution, something that requires a type of intervention different from everything the protocol contemplates. Then it showed me Brazil. I saw the northeastern coast and Sao Paulo with that sky that in my vision had the color of oxidized copper, but that coloration didn't come from external pollution, it came from within. It was a condition of the spirit of that region and not of the air. I saw Rio de Janeiro. I smelled an odor that wasn't physical, but that the soul perceives with the same clarity with which the body perceives the smell of burning before seeing fire. Sulfur and metal. an odor that in my medical practice I associate with the wards where something has gone irreparably wrong. He took me south, toward there. Great jungles and mountains of the interior, and for a moment I felt genuine relief, because in those natural spaces something still breathed with purity. But he stopped me and showed me that even in nature there are places that man has defiled, both with dark rituals and with decades of greed and organized violence, and pacts that were not with God, that the earth itself will begin to expel those who are there when the time comes. He spoke to me of zones of silence that save Anacrea in 2026, Lugares don no communication signal will work, where darkness will have a temporary license to manifest itself in ways that have no name in any of the classification systems that science has developed so far. And she said something that I, as a neurologist, understood in a very particular way. Tell them to seek the height, not the height of mountains, the height of prayer. I saw Mexico and Colombia being shaken by pressures that came from within and without at the same time. And not only earthquakes or economic crises, although I also saw those with a disturbing clarity. It was something deeper than geology or macroeconomics. It was the accumulated result of decades of individual and collective decisions that went in the opposite direction of the sacred. I saw entire cities where divine protection was being withdrawn, not as punishment from an angry God who decides to make his creatures suffer, but as the natural and inevitable consequence of everything built on flawed foundations, like when an organ begins to fail in medicine, not because someone attacked it from the outside, but because internal conditions accumulated over years finally overwhelmed the system's capacity to compensate. He was very clear about this and repeated it in a way that left me with no possible doubt. Warning about these places is not to sow fear. Fear belongs to the enemy. The warning is from the mother who sees her daughter about to take a step into the void and grabs her arm before it's too late. But right after, when I felt I could process what I was seeing, he showed me something that made me recoil with a horror unparalleled in any experience of my life, professional or personal. I saw a date written in the sky over one of the most important cities in Europe. A date that coincides with a huge global event scheduled for 2026, and I saw that among the people celebrating in that city walked figures that were not human, not monsters in the sense that cinema has taught us to imagine them. That would have been easier to process. They were beings that had the approximate appearance of people, but that radiated a very ancient darkness. Not darkness as the absence of physical light, but darkness as the absence of divine origin. They fed on the noise and the forgetting of God with an efficiency that reminded me, with all the coldness of my scientific training, of the parasites I studied in microbiology, organisms perfectly adapted to a specific environment, and the environment of 2026 is the one that most favors them in all of documented human history. What I saw happen in that place, which the whole world is eager to visit this year, was so disturbing that here in this bed, telling you about it now, I feel my heart rate rising. My physical body remembers what my soul experienced there. And I understood at that moment that there are places that shouldn't just be avoided because of natural disasters or economic crises or political instability. They must be avoided because in 2026 they will become open portals for something that humanity collectively hasn't seen or processed for millennia, and for which we have no preparation, neither individually nor institutionally. My throat closed when I tried to ask what we could do to stop it. And that's when she looked at me, because in that moment of the vision, the presence took a form that, for me, was that of a mother, and she revealed to me the first place on the list. A place that millions of people consider sacred because of sports and culture and what it represents as a symbol of unity in a world that has fewer and fewer symbols of genuine unity. A place that in 2026 will be the center of a revelation that will cambiar el destino de todos los que están presentes. El estadio estaba envuelto en una roar that made the air vibrate with a frequency that I, as a neurologist, know. affects the autonomic nervous system in ways that the attendees are not in a position to recognize as external, because they feel them as their own. A tide of colors and flags waving under a sun that seemed too bright to be real. I recognized the flags of Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and I understood immediately that I was watching the 2026 World Cup. But not as a spectator and not from the level of the visible. I was watching from the level of what is happening beneath what the cameras can record. As people shouted, celebrating what seemed to be a moment of global unity, she squeezed my hand, and the roar transformed. I stopped hearing shouts of joy. I began to hear a muffled wail. A low-frequency hum emanating from the chests of the thousands of people inside. A sound that in my clinical practice I would relate to the nervous system. Under a load it doesn't recognize as a threat, but which the body is already registering and processing as such, without the conscious mind knowing it. And she told me with a sadness that pierced me to my very core, look beneath the apparent joy, Valentina, because this is number one on the list. In 2026, large mass gatherings won't be to celebrate life, they'll be to feed an invisible altar. What I saw then made me want to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I was compelled to witness the truth that the world will ignore precisely because it is disguised as a party. I saw that their natural wind wasn't blowing over that crowd. A kind of grayish energy net floated, connecting people's minds to each other, without them realizing it. A net that wasn't metaphorical and wasn't symbolic, it was functional. He operated on the collective neurology of that crowd in a way that, with all my training, I had no prior categories to classify. He explained that this year, technology and humanity's emotional state had created a fragility that had never existed before on this scale, a fragility that makes crowds permeable to things that in other times would have required very specific conditions to function. He showed me that in the middle of a match, an inexplicable event was going to occur in the sky above the stadium. It wasn't a natural disaster, it was something people would call a celestial vision, a contact, or a sign from the universe. A light so beautiful and so seductive that millions would fall to their knees, believing that world peace had finally arrived, that division and fear had ended. But he warned me with a firmness that admitted no alternative interpretations. Not everything that glitters comes from my father. In 2026, deception will disguise itself as light to attract those who hunger for miracles. But they are not thirsty for truth. She made me understand that those large stadiums and the mass events must be avoided in 2026 because they will become testing grounds for a spiritual frequency that has the capacity to nullify individual will. Not dramatically, not like in science fiction movies, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, almost indistinguishable from what people will interpret as collective enthusiasm and shared emotion. As I continued observing, I saw figures dressed in white with faces too symmetrical to be human begin to appear among the crowd. They walked around, spreading a sense of calm that didn't come from true peace, but from anesthesia. And she told me clearly, peace and security. Listen carefully, peace, but what they are sowing is the forgetting of consciousness. That's when I understood that the main danger of 2026 isn't going to be a bomb, a pathogen, or a financial collapse, although those things will happen too. It's going to be the total loss of individual spiritual identity in favor of a collective mind that someone else is designing and operating. If you've ever felt a peace that doesn't seem natural amidst a crowd that suddenly arrives without proportional reason, write it in the comments because perhaps you're already feeling the first signs of what's being set in motion. The vision shifted and took me out of the stadium, into the streets of the cities that will host the games. Monterey, Guadalajara, Los Angeles, New York. In all of them, by mid-2026, there was an atmosphere of celebration that acted as a veneer concealing a rot beneath. He showed me that beneath the stadiums and their convention centers and the large broadcast spaces, equipment was being installed that had nothing to do with data transmission. For television coverage, it had to do with the emission of frequencies that affect people's nervous systems at levels below the threshold of conscious detection. And she told me, tell them that entertainment is going to be the Trojan horse. Tell them to seek the solitude of their homes, to seek the silence of the countryside, so they don't let themselves be swept away by the call of the world's trumpets. Because those trumpets in 2026 will sound for those who don't have the face they show. I saw that many of these coastal cities, which today are the pride of modernity, will have areas closed to the public in 2026, where things will happen that the press won't report, not because they lack courage, but because the tools the press works with won't be enough to capture what's happening. I felt small, a simple Argentine doctor who one day believed that neurology had all the answers and that stadiums were marvels of engineering and that the brain was the origin of everything that matters. There I saw them as what they really are in 2026, cages of very bright light well constructed. She showed me a map of the United States and Mexico and marked with fire signals the routes people would take to attend those events. These routes are traps, she told me. In 2026, mass displacements will be used to count not only bodies, but something that doesn't appear in any identification system the world knows. I saw how their recognition systems that will be installed on those routes weren't just looking for ordinary biometric information. They were reading something that I, as a neurologist, would like to call an individual electromagnetic signature, but which in her vision was much more than that. They were looking for people who still had a spark of something burning that didn't obey the system. Those who shone differently were registered in a database that didn't belong to any government on Earth. And I was crying, asking her how it was possible that this was happening, how no one was seeing it. And she looked at me with a burning compassion and said, the humanity chose this path when it traded the altar for the screen and my presence for the applause of stadiums. Only those who decide to step away from the world's euphoria will find their way back home. At that moment, the vision of the stadium began to fade. But not to give me rest, but to show me the second place on the list. It suddenly took me to a region of Europe, a place steeped in history and ancient stones, where a treaty was being signed that the entire world celebrated as the end of all wars. I saw a long table made of a material that looked like gold, but to the touch of the soul felt like ice. Around it, leaders of nations that had hated each other for centuries embraced and wept with joy before cameras from all over the world. The entire planet was connected by giant screens, watching that moment, but she pointed to the basement of that same building, and what I saw down there made me understand that the peace humanity proclaims in 2026 won't be what it seems at any of its visible levels. The air suddenly turned cold. We were no longer in the stadium's light or the elegance of that hall of supposed peace. She took me to a desolate place. A desert where the wind howled among ruins that seemed to belong to a very near future. I saw buildings that haven't even been built yet, already reduced to rubble. I saw infrastructure that exists today as a symbol of modernity turned to dust. Or she made me understand that the distance between the stadium's celebration and that desolation was months, not years. Months. She showed me that 2026 has a point of no return, a specific moment in October when the mask will fall, so that it will no longer be possible to readjust it. I wanted to ask the exact date, but at that moment something appeared on the horizon that I can only describe as a column of black fire rising from the earth into the sky. And she turned toward me, and for the first time I saw in that presence something that was not the tenderness of love. Maternal. I saw a holy fury, not a fury of hatred, but a fury of zeal for all that is pure and is being desecrated. She pointed to that column and told me that it was the result of what was happening in the third place that had to be avoided. She held me by the shoulders and forced me to look toward a mountain on the border between two European countries where a huge machine was whirring with an intensity that I perceived not as sound, but as a vibration that was tearing something that in my years of science I never learned to name, but that in that space I recognized as the fabric of reality. And she told me with an urgency that made me vibrate completely inside. Valentina, what they are about to open there is not a particle, it is a door they don't know how to close. I felt a terror that has no equivalent in any of my 20 years of experience in emergency medicine, as I watched shapeless shadows begin to emerge from that crack in reality. But with a will hungry for all that is light. Or I understood that 2026 is not going to be just a year of human crises in the senses that history knows. It is going to be the year of a silent invasion that begins at that exact point on the map and expands through the networks that humankind itself built without knowing for whom it was preparing them. We were on the border between Switzerland and France, in front of the largest scientific complex that humanity has ever built. And what I saw there made me understand that all the neuroscience of which I was so proud was nothing compared to the engineering of the abyss that was being created beneath my feet in those circular tunnels where matter itself is being forced to reveal what should remain closed. She remained by my side, and her presence was the only thing preventing my essence from dissolving in the terror emanating from those underground corridors. White and aseptic, filled with brilliant people in lab coats, who walked with a confidence that, from outside their bodies, I could see was not genuine confidence, but the shadow of a confidence. Their eyes were clouded by something they mistook for genius, but which was actually a very specific darkness that feeds on intelligence ungrounded in their sacred. She showed me that at the center of that collider, matter itself was being tortured to reveal what my father had sealed away out of love. I saw there particles collide, but I didn't see scientific data. I saw tiny cracks opening in their fabric of what protects our dimension from what exists outside of it. He explained to me that in 2026 these experiments will reach a point of frequency and intensity such that the veil separating the physical world from the spiritual world will become so thin that whatever can cross it will be able to do so without significant resistance. This is the third place to avoid, not only that specific complex, but all the cities that have become mirrors of that technological hubris. All those that decided that unlimited human intelligence is the answer and not the source of the problem. What I saw emerging from those cracks had no human form. They were like fragments of liquid darkness with a will of their own, beings that do not belong to our time or our space, who found the cables, the fiber optics, the domestic electricity, and other infrastructure perfectly prepared routes for their movement. And you feel that technology is emptying you of something you can't name, but that you recognize as yours. Write in the comments that you're protecting your soul, because that emptiness has a name and an address, and in 2026 it already has an open door. Then she took me to a place that looked like a hospital, but it was so enormous that the corridors stretched beyond what human vision can reach. The smell was a mixture of antiseptic with something sweet, almost cloying, which I, as a doctor, immediately recognized. It was the smell of procedures that require emotional anesthesia, in addition to chemical anesthesia. I saw lines of people waiting with desperate hope in their eyes, a hope that wasn't seeking healing from a specific disease, was seeking something bigger, or was seeking the ultimate solution to the human condition. I sought to escape fragility, mortality, and uncertainty through the door of technology, not the door of faith. She stopped with me. at the entrance to a room that used no scalpel, no medication, none of the tools I recognized from my work. It used violet light beams of an intensity unmatched by any equipment in any hospital where I had ever worked. She turned to me, and her voice took on a tone I had never heard before in that vision, a tone that let me know what I was about to see was the ultimate breaking point for the human race, as we know it. And she said, "Look closely at what human beings are willing to do to their own bodies to avoid encountering me. But this is the place where my father's original design will be challenged one last time before my return." What I saw happen inside that room was so unnatural that I felt the veil between my life and my death tear again from within. They weren't sick people seeking a cure for a clinical condition. They were healthy people, young and old alike, waiting in orderly, silent lines to undergo what the world in 2026 will call holistic enhancement, a process that modifies not what the body does, but what the body is at its most fundamental level. She looked at me with a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of all human history condensed into a single instant, and said, "Daughter, look closely at what they're doing. They've stopped searching for eternal life in my spirit to seek a plastic eternity in their own blood. This is the fourth place to avoid at all costs. The centers where life is being redesigned." I saw a young woman lying on a bed of